What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Danny and Bush excited to bring to you a brand new installment, a brand new series to the channel. Not totally brand new because we did it last year, but ADP Battles is back. You guys are going to probably remember that we did prospect battles in the draft cycle where we talked about two different prospects going around a similar range and discussed their merits, strengths, and weaknesses versus each other. Well, we're doing the same kind of thing. When you guys are on the clock in your drafts, you got to know, am I picking this guy or am I picking that guy? That's the decision that we're going to come to today. If you guys haven't already done so, I encourage you to like, comment, subscribe on this video and all of our videos. We're on the road to 5,000 subscribers. We're hoping to get there by August 1st, and we need your help to do so. So make sure you subscribe if you haven't already done so. Danny, how are you doing today?
Doing well, and I'm excited as hell, man. This is a series that I ran all offseason last summer, really taking in depth going into the season on who you should be drafting. Yes, baby. ADP Battles is back. Some of y'all, if you're true OGs of the channel, will remember it.
We've seen this series being run on a couple other fantasy channels. No problem. Often imitated, never duplicated. Let's hit the fucking intro.
Going in depth on Brandon Aiyuk versus Odell Beckham Jr.
If you guys don't want to see our ugly mugs every time we do this ADP battles, don't worry. It's going to be an alternating thing. 1 week I'm going to be on here with a guest. 1 week Danny's going to be on here with a guest. And then obviously if plans fall through, then we'll jump on here together and take care of that episode. But you're going to see a lot more recurring guests on this series specifically with some short form content. So like Danny mentioned, Brandon Aiyuk versus Odell Beckham. Who should you draft? Where are they going? Danny, where are they going in drafts right now?
Glad you asked. They're currently going off the board back-to-back at 63 and 64, with Brandon Aiyuk being the wide receiver 27 and Odell Beckham the wide receiver 28 in terms of ADP.
Right. So we'll start with the young buck here. We'll go with Brandon Aiyuk. And the way we're going to kind of frame all of these is we're going to start with the good, and then we're going to talk about some concerns for each guy. So the good with Brandon Aiyuk, and there's a lot of it, I don't think people realize just how good this guy was last year. And as you can see on the screen, from pretty much the whole season, 8 out of his 12 games that he played, 12 plus half PPR fantasy points in 8 of 12 games is very good consistency, especially for a rookie receiver. And in 7 of his 12 games, he recorded at least 7 targets and 70 total yards. Not something that a lot of us expected out of Brandon Aiyuk, as he was kind of a surprise first-round pick in the 2020 NFL draft, but he came out guns a-blazing.
Yeah, and people have this stigma around Brandon Aiyuk being this quote-unquote gadget wide receiver who will lose his role when Debo plays for a full season, and that is just simply not the case. I mean, we're talking about Debo, who had an average ADOT of 2.6 yards, with Brandon Aiyuk, who had an average ADOT of over 9 yards, and with Kittle operating the middle seam. All three of these guys are operating completely unique, completely distinct roles in this offense, and what should be one of the best offenses in the entire league, in my opinion. And before anybody says, well, what about his snap share in the slot? Like, how did that really rank? He spent 574 of his 733 total 2020 snaps on the outside. I mean, he is the true operant of the X role in this Shanahan offense that we can identify. Now, people want to when people describe the X wide receiver position in the NFL, they think normally as this bigger, hulking outside receiver who can win on fade routes, who can win down the field. And we just kind of got to relax on this general X narrative and relate it to what Shanahan looks for from his wide receivers. Quick, efficient yak monsters. And out of all their wide receivers on the current roster, Brandon Aiyuk was both the most utilized and both most successful when operating at the out wide position. And when you're talking about this guy, when I'm mentioning efficiency, nothing better to measure efficiency than Matt Harmon himself in his reception perception. So you guys can see on the screen, Brandon Aiyuk was one of the most efficient receivers at basically any of the routes. I mean, we're talking the 9 route, the post route, the corner route. All of his routes, apart from the flat, which haters might point out, are going to be above average. I mean, he is green in every single aspect. And as you can see, that 2020 performance, that 2020 production wasn't a byproduct of a faltering offense in terms of inadequate weaponry. He was just simply flat out hashtag good at football, as a lot would say.
Right. And Brandon Aiyuk down the stretch especially was very, very good. From week 8 on, he was a top 20 wide receiver. I believe he was wide receiver 16 in points per game. And his quarterback was Nick Mullins for that whole time. Jimmy Garoppolo was out of the lineup. He had Nick Mullins as his quarterback, and he still was able to do that down the stretch. And again, Deebo Samuel came back. George Kittle came back towards the end of the year. And speaking of, I'm sure we'll get into some of the concerns right now. I'm sure the biggest concern people have is, can all three of these guys coexist? Everybody knows this is a run-heavy offense, quote unquote, because of Kyle Shanahan. But do we have a sample of all three of these guys on the field, and what were their, roles, targets, receptions, and touchdowns? Well, as you can see on the screen, weeks 5 to 7 is the only 3 games in which all 3 of these guys were on the field. And you can see targets 25 for George Kittle, 16 for Brandon Aiyuk, and Deebo Samuel 21. Pretty similar yardage and a touchdown for each. The 16-game pace of each, 133 targets, 1,100 total yards, 5 touchdowns for George Kittle. Pretty solid. I would imagine he'll probably beat those numbers. 85 targets, 912 yards, 5 touchdowns for Brandon Aiyuk. And then 112 targets, 821 total yards, 5 touchdowns for Deebo Samuel. Pretty respectable numbers for these guys. And Aiyuk specifically, because of his efficient nature, the way he played last year, the really impressive thing was who these 3 games were against. Brandon Aiyuk and Deebo Samuel and George Kittle did this against the Patriots and the Rams, and both of those guys were top 5 in passing defense last year. And the other game was against the Miami Dolphins, and the Miami Dolphins were no slouch against the pass either. And on top of that, Jimmy Garoppolo left that game halfway through, and CJ Beathard finished the game. So when you consider the fact that Aiyuk specifically didn't break out until the second half of the year after this sample size that I already talked about, I mean, the sky's the limit for this guy. All 3 of these guys were quite solid and could improve if Trey Lance is a better passer than what Jimmy Garoppolo and half of CJ Beathard was in this sample size. And I think at worst, we're getting Jimmy G back healthy, and that alone is an upgrade from what Aiyuk saw last year.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree here. Again, the problem on the surface for most people in the fantasy industry is how the overall passing volume is going to get adjusted. I mean, we're talking about a team who threw the ball 570 times last year. How would adding a more not only run adequate quarterback with Trey Lance, but a true weapon at the position in terms of running the football with Trey Lance would impact the offense? While the quote-unquote overall volume may go down with Trey Lance in the lineup, can we not just take a moment to grasp at the general efficiency of this team? I mean, we're talking about going from fucking Nick Mullins, CJ Beathard, and Jimmy Garoppolo to a consensus top 5 overall pick, a guy that was actually selected at 3rd overall in this NFL draft. I mean, I just think the sky is the limit here. And while plenty of people are going to push the narrative of, as you mentioned, too many mouths to feed, not enough volume, this is where you take the dip. We're going to be talking about it with Hayden Winks in terms of strategy, but the main thing that you can take advantage of in this current time when you're drafting your teams, when you're doing your best balls, take advantage of uncertainty. There are going to be people that are fading all of Kittle, Deebo, Aiyuk, because they're not sure how this offense is going to look in 2021. That is where the true sharps come out of the dark and take advantage at these ADP dips. And you're talking about a guy in Brandon Aiyuk who was as efficient and as productive as he was last year, going in the early 6th round at this point. You take that value and you run with it. Get that uncertainty discount and take it to the bank.
Yeah, absolutely. You basically summed it completely up. That uncertainty discount is going to be real. The casual player, the lazy analyst or whatever is going to peddle the narrative that this team is going to be a run-heavy offense next year. And while they are probably going to be bottom half of the league in pass attempts, Trey Lance, to me, is a better quarterback right now than Jimmy Garoppolo. I think he's a better passer right now than Jimmy Garoppolo. And if he's going to be more efficient, then that means Aiyuk, Deebo, Kittle, they're all going to be more efficient. We already talked about on our tight end rankings video that George Kittle's touchdown upside could go up. Well, the same is true for Brandon Aiyuk, especially as the guy operating as the X receiver in this offense. We've seen an X receiver get fed in Kyle Shanahan's offense before. And I'm not calling it Brandon Aiyuk, Julio Jones, but he could fill that role in Kyle Shanahan's offense.
I mean, are we not even looking back at the days of even Pierre Garçon? We've had productive... talking about Pierre Garçon and freaking RG3's rookie season to begin with. We're talking about efficient receivers that have really operated as true number ones in this team. And as much as I love Deebo, Brandon Aiyuk profiles as a true number one comparatively to Deebo Samuel. I mentioned the A-dot. I mentioned the usage. This was a guy that I was actually used down the field. So I love all these 49ers at ADP, but the fact that Aiyuk is currently going in the 6th round is just crazy to me.
Right. And I think that's probably enough on Brandon Aiyuk. You guys can probably imagine we're quite high on the guy. We both like him as a mid-round guy. And like Hayden and us are going to talk about, he fits in that honeypot of rounds 3 to 7 in both season-long drafts, once those come along, and currently in best ball drafts. When you're looking for receiver talent, betting on a young, talented receiver in the mid rounds is always a good idea, because more often than not, they're probably going to pay off. This is where guys like DK Metcalf and guys like Terry McLaurin and guys like AJ Brown and Cortland Sutton and all these players were in this range of the draft the years that they broke out. And Brandon Aiyuk, to me, is just the next guy in line. So let's move on to a guy who was once a very young, talented player, but has fallen a little bit from grace, especially last year. You guys know we were all the way out on this dude. Odell Beckham, to both me and you, was like, he was ranked as like my 40th wide receiver last year. I didn't want anything to do with the guy, but I will start with the good here, because I actually think that Odell's outlook this year is better than it's been in a couple years, at least in my eyes. No, Odell is no longer the freakish fantasy superstar that he was as a New York Giant, but this is still a guy with solid upside, in my opinion. And the main reason is due to his situation, not because he used to do it or because he's been the wide receiver one before. No, the reason he has upside is because of his situation. We'll get to the low pass volume of the Browns offense in a second, but Odell himself actually received decent volume to start last season. You can see on his game logs right now, 10 targets, 6 targets, 6 targets, 8 targets, 9 targets. And then in that 3-target game, I believe he left early in that one, and that's when he tore his ACL. So you have to take that with a grain of salt. Obviously, the targets didn't quite lead to fantasy production all the way around, except for in that Cowboys game where he absolutely snapped off. But the targets were there last year, and we're going to get into, how the Browns offense is going to change in a second. But what are your thoughts on Odell's role within the offense? I think his role is still the number one target, and I actually do still like Jarvis Landry too.
For sure. And again, you guys can see on the screen, but I talked about Brandon Aiyuk's reception perception this past year, but they don't really have the sample of Odell in 2020, but it still showed in 2019 that he was a very capable number one wide receiver. So he was above average or better in all but 3 of the graded route concepts you guys can see. So the problem that I have with Odell is, despite the solid success rates we've seen a huge Odell decline from what was a once locked in, set it and forget it wide receiver one. The one that has really marred fantasy owners in the past 3 years in terms of being a fantasy headache. I get it. I fully understand. You're not drafting this guy to be your wide receiver one anymore. We're drafting this guy in the 6th round, and I do think that is a fair value. But again, we're still talking about a 29-year-old wide receiver coming off a torn ACL on a team that ran the ball at the 4th highest clip and targeted the wide receiver position at a 53% clip in 2020, which was the 5th lowest league-wide and 8% below the league average of 61%. And while he's an exciting player, don't get me wrong, like if he's there 7th, mid-7th type area, like I'll take the upside shot on him, because I still think he could be capable of a top 15 type finish given his status as the number one in this offense. But in terms of overall range of outcomes, both his floor and his ceiling, I just think are less than Aiyuk's.
Right. And when you get into the floor, obviously, and the ceiling cap, everything kind of revolves around the fact that the major analysis that's going to come about Odell Beckham is going to be relating to the pass volume of the Browns offense. But one thing I would like to paint as a bit of a rosier picture is that following their week 9 bye, I talked about this with Baker Mayfield on the Sleepers episode. They played a monsoon game against Houston in week 10, but after that is when you saw this offense take a big time leap. And not only from an efficiency perspective, Baker Mayfield went from 6.9 yards per attempt from weeks 1 to 10 to nearly 8 yards per attempt that week 11 through the 2 playoff games that they have. I think this should have been expected with the COVID offseason for a new coaching staff. I think we should have expected this offense to get out to a slower start. And Mayfield, more importantly than anything else, was actually on pace for 558 pass attempts if you take week 11 through the playoff game. So while they're not going to be a top 5, top 10 passing volume offense, I think people are going to overrate a little bit how much they're going to run the ball. I think they're going to be closer to league average than people think. And what I saw from an efficiency perspective and what the numbers bear out is what I'm guessing we can see coming into next year. And with the second year in Stefanski's system and Odell actually on the field, because during that time he wasn't playing, obviously, because he tore his ACL, which we'll get into in a second. But they were passing the ball at a higher rate. And we saw Jarvis Landry be pretty, relevant for fantasy. And I think with Odell back on the field, we're going to see them adapt to a little bit more of a balanced approach instead of being so run heavy like they were at the beginning of the season.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. Again, we're talking about a COVID-shortened offseason, as you mentioned. It's going to take time to gel in a new system. And in general, if you're talking about a timing-based, rhythm-based plan of attack from the passing game, and you have already one of the best running offenses in the league, why wouldn't you take the burden off of your passing offense while they really work out those kinks, work out those issues? And we saw it. I mean, you mentioned week 10 on, they were a much different team passing the football. Again, making this video, this is no slight against Odell Beckham. I think he's a more than fine 7th round, wide receiver 3 upside type pick. You want to get a guy who, you know, you have a more safe team. You want to take the gamble on him. I'm fine with that. But this is kind of, if you're going to take one lesson from this video, it's that Brandon Aiyuk is being slept on.
Right, totally. And I think if we would have done this, the guy going immediately after this is Courtland Sutton. If we would have done Courtland Sutton versus Odell Beckham, this is probably a lot closer of a conversation.
Yeah.
But in both of our opinions, Brandon Aiyuk belongs to go a lot higher than this because everything about his situation is looking up, and we have some concerns about Odell. And I'll let you get into the last big one that we do have.
Yeah, 100%. I mentioned briefly with the ACL injury that he did suffer. That is a very big issue. I mean, again, we're talking about a 29-year-old wide receiver coming off a season-ending injury. I mean, we've seen it in recent years. The AJ Greens of the world, the Des Bryants of the world. As crazy as it sounds, Odell Beckham is not far off of where we saw those guys hit their downfalls. He's 29 years old. I mean, if you were to ask anybody and their mother how old Odell Beckham was, I bet you nobody would say 29. It seems like this guy is still that 24, 25-year-old superstar dominating on the Giants, but that just simply isn't the case. He is an aging player.
And another thing, too, with Odell Beckham is that he's been injured in other areas of his body, right? Like he's had ankle injuries. He's had, you know, soft tissue stuff that's hampered him in the past. He had a sports hernia last year or 2 years ago that we had Dr. Edwin Porras talk about on the show. And this is a guy that's had injury issues, you know, all the time. So the ACL tear isn't necessarily my biggest concern because we've seen ACL tears be a relatively quick process. It's just the injuries in general with Odell Beckham. And the fact that he is an older player coming off of another injury for the 3rd straight year, it seems like, is definitely a concern for him. So that's kind of the ugly with Odell is the injury concerns. But unlike last year, I'm not totally out on this guy. I do think I'm going to have some shares of him because I think he's more appropriately valued compared to what he was last year. He was like a 4th, 5th round pick last year.
Yeah.
I think he's being a little bit more. Rounder. Yeah.
I think he's going in that 3rd round.
Right. And I think he's more appropriately valued now. But like you said, Aiyuk smash spot. He's way ahead of Odell in my rankings for sure.
Absolutely. So we can segment this last little bit as the decision. And if you guys haven't already been able to tell from the mood of this video, our decision is both going to be Brandon Aiyuk. I mean, this is a guy you're currently getting as outside of a wide receiver 2 type cost, who has legitimate, in my opinion, wide receiver 1 upside.
Right. Exactly. I totally agree. And if you guys enjoyed this video, and if you guys enjoy these videos in general, I can encourage you to comment down below, like how much you enjoy these, because we're going to try and integrate more short form content on our channel. I know there's a lot of other fantasy YouTube channels out there that do like 5-minute videos, 10-minute videos. For us, short form content is more 15-minute videos because, I mean, we get so deep, we get so invested in an argument and in a case for a player that we have to go a little bit longer. But let us know how you guys think about this video. It should be about, 17 minutes or so once it's edited down. So yeah, like, comment, subscribe. Goal is 5K by August 1st. Danny, what do you got?
I'm going to say one more thing. If you've made it this far in the video, comment down below ADP Battles is back.
Why you need the